I'm really excited to get back into panel discussions because they're one of my favorite things to do at the show. If you don't know me, I'm Mike Corrado. I work with NPS, Nikon Pro Services, and I've been with Nikon for 39 million years, it seems like, but 39 years in reality. So we have a great time when we get to get into the minds of the photographers that we work with. Because, as Joe may say, he didn't start off as Joe McNally, maybe by birth and name, but the name in photography has grown through the years. Jim Graham has been one of my favorite people, so I'm more excited, because I know you so much, to have Jim here for the first time to be able to talk about the work he does. And I think what's exciting about this for me is when you get to be inspired by these great photographers and you get to hear the stories and the backstories, I would think that you guys would agree that it's not an easy street all the time, and that this stuff just doesn't go poof, great photo. You got to work at this stuff, right? Joe, is that a reality?
No, this is incredibly easy. The automatic cameras, no.
So
I'm kidding. This is a wonderful thing to do. It's also a difficult thing to do. Anything worthwhile has its measures of difficulty, for sure.
Yes. The only easy street I've ever been on is on Nantucket, and it's flooded most of the time.
And Jim, you are a native. Your roots are from Kentucky?
My mother's family is all from Louisville, Kentucky, from my great-great-grandfather on. The family owned the stockyards here in Louisville. The Bourbon stockyards were part of our family for 100 years.
So I always like to start off this way. I mean, I ask the audience and you out there in live stream world, like how many people know Jim Graham and Joe McNally, but just let's assume, Joe, nobody knows who you are. Talk a little bit briefly about your career path, how you land here with me today.
Well, it's been a long, strange trip, as they kind of say in the movies. You know, I started as a newspaper wire service photographer on the streets of New York. You know, super basic. Didn't know the first thing about flash. And then all of a sudden I got thrown into magazines. And people in magazines were like, hey, we shoot Kodachrome. You know, you got to learn how to use some lights. And that began an arc of learning and travel, and my own personal education and experience in photography just kept ramping up from there. And at the end of the day, I would simply describe myself as a generalist. I'm a people photographer. If people are doing it, I'm curious about it.
Pretty cool. And we've gotten to work together on quite a few different shoots. We're going to roll some pictures of their work in the background, and then I've defined about 4 each from you that I want to talk about in depth, if that's okay with you. Jim, give everybody a little background on your career and how we get here.
And I am very much the same as Joe. I started out working for the News Journal paper in Wilmington, Delaware. Went on, did AP, did UPI, did Bloomberg News, left the paper, went on to magazines. I do fine artwork, I do weddings. I'm very much a generalist. I really believe, especially from the newspaper training, that you had to be ready to do just about everything. You had to be willing to work with a CEO, and you had to be willing to work with a guy who's down on his luck, and you had to treat them all the same. Be kind, be gentle, and use your eye.
You know, be kind, be gentle would be exactly the way I describe you as a person from the years that I've known you. And I think that's important to take to the portrait work you do. But Joe, I'm going to come back to you. When you use the word generalist, right? Now I hear this from you, Jim. Yeah. Being a generalist keeps you versatile, keeps you moving, keeps you prepared for just about any assignment. But if someone were to ask you, and I'm going to ask you, what does a portrait mean to you? If you're given a portrait assignment, you've got to photograph a person, what's the first thing you're thinking about in producing a portrait?
It's, as I often refer to portraiture, it's a face and a place. You use the human face, locate it in a way that those elements combine and tell the story of that person. And it isn't necessarily always the face of that person. When you think portrait, you always think face. But I've done some quote-unquote portraits of people's hands. I'm very attentive to the nuances and details of people, the way they look, how comfortable they are, the way life has written lines on their face, their hands, their body. And I'm sensitive to it, and I move in any direction that makes them feel comfortable and renders some measure of truth about their life to the camera.
You know, it's funny too, because I think, and you know I love photographing people as well, children, the cancer kids over at the Ronald McDonald House, and When I first started this, I think I looked more for the impact of an image than thinking about somebody's soul or who they are or what they do, because the more important thing is to tell the story about that person. Jim, talk a little bit about what a portrait means to you and how do you tell that story?
It is so much the story. And so many times the story is either told with light, where the light is, where the light isn't. It's told with their eyes. I am a big believer that a portrait is a conversation. And I converse with my subjects all the time. And many times I'll turn the camera around. Today, thank you for having that wonderful viewfinder on the back, or screen on the back of the camera.
I was responsible for that, you know that, right?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. But those conversations, because of that screen that's on the back of the camera, you can turn it around and you can enlist that subject in your idea. And being able to show them that, 9 times out of 10 calms them. And then you start to build and build and build that relationship. And the relationships can last for years. And learning everybody's story, you always have an opportunity to learn when you're a photographer, because you're in all different situations. And that's the beauty of it.
You know, that's so huge, because Joe and I have worked together so many times. We talked about the importance of relationships with the subjects, not the day you shoot them, but 10 years later, 15 years later. And later we're going to talk about a 9/11 photo that Joe made of a firefighter and how 10 years later went back and the anniversaries and still work with these people and know these people. But that's very, very key. I always find it very important to know, where do your inspirations come from? Are you looking at spreadsheets? Are you looking at magazines? I used to look at old artwork, you know, from the Renaissance era for action photography, actually through painting and Peter Paul Rubens. I'm going to start with you, Jim. Talk a little bit about your inspirations, and where would you recommend anybody go if they need to really say, you know, I want to do this. Who do I look at? Who's going to inspire you?
So the person that found me was a man named Pat Crow. Pat saw me on the sidelines of a football game, and he had literally just won National Press Photographers Association Pictures of the Year award. And he took me under his wing and started to show me pictures and asking me to send him pictures. And for 4 years, I sent him pictures. He would write on them and send them back, and he coached me all the way through. The person that taught him was W. Eugene Smith, who one could argue is the father of photojournalism. So that way I think of Gene Smith as my grandfather. Mm-hmm. But I also grew up in a little town called Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. And if you know about Chadds Ford, you know that there is a painter or a family of painters there named Wyeth. So I grew up 3 miles from Andrew Wyeth's home. I knew Andrew, and his son Jamie was at one point my 4th grade art teacher. So I draw a lot of inspiration and feeling from some of the subject matter that they had, and I still have with them.
You mentioned Andrew Wyeth before, and a picture in our home is a picture of Christina's world, and I love that photo, and I wanted to go to that hill and recreate that with my daughter, who's named Christina. You
actually can. Yeah. There is a wonderful field in front of the Olson house in Cushing, Maine. It's still there. There are a few trees that have grown up in that, but you can still sort of get that. And the beauty of that image is Andrew is buried, along with his wife Betsy, in the cemetery that's down the hill and has that same view looking up at the house.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. So, Mr. McNally, talk about a few of the people that have inspired you along the way.
You know, the beautiful thing about the photo community, it's a very giving community. Agreed. And we mentor each other. And that's a powerful thing, because I received very powerful mentorship when I was a young photographer from a variety of sources. So I would say sometimes I was mentored quite violently. You know, a wire service editor in New York on deadline is not going to cut you much slack if you come in with a poor take. In fact, at one point in time, I shot so poorly that my editor in New York, Larry DeSantis with the UPI, took my 3 rolls of film, crushed them into an acetate ball, reassigned another photographer to go reshoot the job, and when I came into the UPI newsroom, he stood up and he took that ball of film and he threw it at me and hit me in the chest with it, told me to get out, you know, using very colorful language, and not come back until I learned how to use a flash. And there was no human resources back in the day. So what you did was you went to the nearest bar, and you ruminated about your sins and then tried to do better. Now that was a particular type of mentorship, which I don't recommend for anyone. But what I do is I look at a lot of photographs, and that doesn't mean Instagram, swiping, swiping, swiping. I have a big photo library. You mentioned W. Eugene Smith. I wrote a paper about W. Eugene Smith in school. He was a madman, but he was also the creator of the photo form we know now as the photo essay.
Yes.
And so those kinds of influences, my wife is very patient with me because I literally have 300, 400 photo books, and I look at them all the time. If I get really down about my work, and that happens, you get into troughs, you know, I'll go back and I'll open up The Creation by Ernst Haas, and I just feel clean again. It reminds me of why I became a photographer.
I think that's so important, and I'm going to brag a little bit on one of our friends, Jerry Guionis. I've stayed with Jerry during photo shoots a number of times. He's got a huge tripod with a huge base on it, and he's got different portrait photographers' books, and he just flips the pages every day. And from those pages, he'll draw on that inspiration for what other photographers have done, not to plagiarize, but to be inspired to think about doing something a little bit different. So I've done the same thing, only mine's a music stand, and it's tiny little books, but it's a great way of being inspired. So, Joe, this is more for you. Who inspires you that is not a photographer? It's okay. So that's a loaded question. I actually did a panel with Joe at Disney, and I threw that question to him, his wife Annie, in the back of the room. But I would couch that a little bit different. How important is it to have a partner that understands what you're doing?
Yes.
And how you do it?
Photographers, we need support across the board, and in work, in life, etc. And I've just been really blessed that you know, I did a lot of work in my younger career that was had an edge to it, and part of that edge came from the fact that I was unhappy. And when I met Annie, happiness entered my life, and that has infused my work ever since then. It also has relocated photography for me to a place in my life where I'm comfortable with it. I used to, you know, breathe fire and chew steel, you know, and I would go and go and go. And then when Annie entered my life, I realized, well, there's a place for this, but the place for her is the most important place I have in my heart.
Jim, do you have that same kind of support?
I certainly understand that, yes. I'm very lucky right now, and the person that I'm with calms me down a lot, very supportive.
We need that.
Yes, it's there. The only thing that I don't have that I really would wish for, I wish that I had somebody that would do all the business end for me.
Important.
That would let me do what I do best, which is use the camera and go out and work on that imagery, find those things that really mean something to me. At this point, I like to think that I'm trying to do art more than anything else. Even if it's still for a magazine, even if it's company, I want to do art. I don't want to, I'm not as interested in just total realism anymore.
I think that's so important, and Joe and I talk about this all the time when we're working together. His studio manager, Lynn, and his wife, Annie, we call them the brains. We're the brawn, they're the brains. Because we need people smarter than us doing social and doing all the other stuff behind the scenes. And Lynn does all the business, because we've worked on projects together, and all the booking, the production work, and reaching out and getting all of the permits and things like that. That's a huge part of this business, so we can create.
Yes.
So it's very important. We're just going to roll through the pictures just a little bit more, and then we're going to start to isolate certain images that I chose that I thought were very interesting, and I'd love to hear a little backstory on. But when you're approaching a portrait, talk a little bit about, like, you're given the assignment, location or studio, why one or the other. Joe, with you first.
Sure. I mean, it drives forward from the story. What is the mission of the photograph? If you're on assignment, you're not out there for a lark. You oftentimes have to reverse engineer your solution out of what the client or the magazine or the newspaper wants. So the first and foremost thing I do when I get an assignment revolving around someone is I research. I research as much as I possibly can. I research tangents in their life, the situation I might be walking into. I make phone calls. I try, if there's budget and time, we'll send out an assistant to do scouting, to see what the lay of the land, the physical lay of the land is. And all of that starts to filter back to you in terms of ideas. And that, here's the thing, you can walk into these situations with the most thorough pre-visualization you could possibly imagine. And then you get there and things go sideways and you have to take and throw all of it out the window and improvise. But the research, I find, gives you the ability to improvise in a creative way because that you got that backlog of knowledge. And you also, it's psychological, right? You research someone, like I shot Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton's book jacket pictures. Well, Chelsea is a mom and she was pregnant at the time, but I researched I knew her kids' names, I knew where they were at school, I knew recent developments in their life, and so it gives you an ability to have chatter at the camera, and it puts people on your side. Yeah. They start to relax and think, okay, all right, this photographer's done their homework, they're on my side. And you can almost physically see them relax because you've done the work.
Jim, same question.
And that idea of knowing your client, in my case, many of my assignments don't come weeks in advance, they come hours in advance. I'll have a magazine that calls me up and says, Jim, we need you to go and do a picture of this person, and you have an hour. And so you hope you know what I have always believed is that every assignment that I get is a learning experience. It's an opportunity for me to find out about you, and find out something that honestly I can take with me to every assignment. Because knowing a broad base of people, understanding what a painter might do, an engineer might do, helps me to learn their language. And if I understand their language, I can go on and talk to that person, and just having that little bit of a conversation early on, even before I pick up a camera, makes all the difference in the world.
All right, we're improving right now, and somebody is touching Joe's behind, but I promise you it's not anything offensive. He's changing the microphone right now.
You've got the good
There's nothing
mic.
to see. All right. Yeah, I thought that was when you turn your head. I was going to say stop turning your head, but it wasn't. It must have been the mic. Well, and it'll be the last time. Can we go to the click-through pictures, and let's start talking about some of the individuals that I really like. Don't look back. I got this. If you want to look, it's right there on the screen in front of you.
So that's a...
All right, we're here. We're not there yet. Wait, you hold back. We're not at the Kentucky Derby yet.
Oh, come on.
All right. Well, and I wanted to see some of the portraits that we put into the rolling set were on location in the middle of an event. And one of the things like shooting rock and roll or sports, I've always looked for the portrait moment within the action, and we'll talk about this. What struck me about this is something you brought up earlier, and something I've always preached about eye contact. There are times for the subject to look right into the camera, and times not. This was up at a Nikon show many years ago in a very big print. I believe D800, somewhere in that neighborhood.
I think it is an 800, yeah.
So I'm going to turn it to you. Tell a little bit of story about this picture, why it's important to you, and if you guys can cite the lens you may remember using. I know that may be tough for you, but if you can remember the lens or the body that you may have used, and what the strategy was and the thought behind this photo.
Well, so in this case, this is a D800, exactly. It's the 105 it's the macro. It's the 105 macro.
105 2.8.
And I still use that same lens all the time. It's a wonderful portrait lens. It gives me a little bit of space to work, and it just, what it does with features is wonderful. I think part of this image for me is the contact with this young woman. And the light was just stunning that day. It's a very simple portrait. She's literally, as I remember, on a porch. And we started having a conversation. I made the image. It was very confrontational in some ways, but just the skin, the eyes, and the amount of sharpness that's in her pupils, it sort of seduced me in a way. and then taking it into black and white, leaving just an ever bit. Frankly, it's not completely black and white. I tend to use layers in Photoshop so that I've left enough so that I get a little bit of color in her lip. But it just was wonderful. And her name is Leah, as I remember, and every once in a while I still see her out there.
You know, it's very striking, and I will say this, admit this, a lot of times photographing gorillas, you know, you want some of the warmth in the eyes, but you don't want to lose the black, right? So you want the dark depth within the blacks and the shadowed areas. So I'll convert the picture to black and white, and I'll repaint the color back in on the eyes to have that stark black and white meet the color, and it's just so much more impactful as we do that. Now, I'm very familiar with this shoot. We worked on this for Nikon for the 105mm f1.4, which if you're on the Z lens side now, the 85 1.2 is pretty killer. Talk a little bit about the Showgirl. You put a lot into this photo in the way of production, and how much goes into this, and I'm sure, you know, Lynn is probably more responsible than you. You just go in and click it, right?
Well, this harks back to relationships. This is Jolie. She's a dancer in Las Vegas, phenomenally talented lady. She's in the new Awakening show in Vegas, and I have worked with her now for about a dozen years and photographed her many times. A lot of photographers tend to, especially in the fashion world, for instance, they seek a new face all the time. I'm very comfortable working with people who trust me, who I know, who I have relationships with. And Jolie is just phenomenal in front of the camera. And this is done with speedlights. It actually wasn't that, in terms of production, you know, it wasn't that huge a deal when it came around down to the technique, because I shot it with speedlights, you know, stuff that comes out of a bag. And all of the other stuff that went into it, staging and the makeup and all of that, that was a part. The actual execution of the picture was pretty straightforward.
What softening box, what was the tool on the speedlight to get this kind of light?
I had a little square softbox overhead of her, and then a thing called an uplight on the floor, which was an angled diffuser with two speedlights underneath of it coming up, and then there was one speedlight behind her, just providing a little bit of, I'm not supposed to turn around, you know, I've been warned. You
can. It's actually better for live stream if you turn around, because they can't see that monitor over there.
So, so there's a little bit of rim light behind her, which you can't really see in this instance because I'm cropped pretty tight. But when you're working with someone who's as comfortable in front of the camera as Jolie is, it makes your job so easy.
Jim, I bounced to this picture. The only word that comes to mind for me is peace. This person feels relaxed and at peace. What is this picture? I'm dying to know.
So this particular picture is a picture that I just did for a magazine. It's a story that I pitched on Jamie Wyeth. This is Andrew Wyeth's son. He's about to open a new show at the Brandywine River Museum and also at Somerville Manning Gallery down where I live in Wilmington, Delaware. And his show is called Unsettled, of all things. I've known Jamie and photographed Jamie for decades. In this case, I had to go interview him and write the story as well as photograph it. He uses this color in his the color that's on the wall in his paintings all the time. And so I'm trying to represent Jamie as best I can. He isolates himself all the time in order to have the calmness to paint the way he paints. He paints a world that is different. It's sort of, as the quote from one of the curators said, he paints a world that's in between the natural and supernatural world. And so I needed to represent Jamie in such a way and not get overly cumbersome about what I was shooting with. In this case, as I remember, there's a large umbrella outside the window, outside of his house, and I'm using a Z9 and the 24-70. A lot of times I'll pull the screen up, put it down low like this, and make the image.
Did he show up in this attire, or do you have any influence?
This is what Jamie wears all the time. He's always in mismatched shots. He's always in +4s. He wears this particular vest often. He's got a couple of other different shirts, but this is him. It's really a throwback to his grandfather, to N.C. Wyeth.
Wow.
All right, Joe, I know the history of this picture. It's from part of a film that you created called The Ice is Melting, right?
Right, yeah.
This is an amazing story, so give everybody a little background. Take them to where you are in Alaska, and the story behind this.
This is my friend George, I've known since 2001. The New York Times Sunday Magazine sent me up to this barren stretch of ice called Cooper Island, which is north, out in the sea, north of Barrow, Alaska, which is the northernmost tip of the continental United States. And George is an amazingly tenacious researcher. He's a zoologist by training. And for years, he was studying a colony of black guillemot birds, because that was his specialty, Arctic seabirds. But he realized over time what he was really doing was studying climate change, because as the Earth has warmed, the colony has shrunk, and Cooper has turned from an icebound island into just brown sand. And so we went up in conjunction with Nikon and did a film called Watching the Earth Melt Away. And I was just very proud of the film, and also proud of the friendship I have with George, because when you're by yourself on an icebound island for 10 days, you find out really quick whether you're going to be friends or not, you know? And I started cooking, like Dinty Moore beef stew, and George loved it. He was like, I can't believe you can cook. You know? And so the two of us started a friendship back then that, in fact, I spoke to him just the other day. He's going to go back up to Cooper. He spends 3 months a year by himself on this island. And this year, he will return for his 50th straight year.
Wow.
You talk about tenacity. That George defines that word.
And you and I have promised to go back for the 50th anniversary.
We have.
We got to keep that promise.
I know.
I think if you research this film, you'll watch it. It's amazing to see. I think the thing that caught me off guard the most was you have one scene from the original picture where he's standing on a big snowbank, ice bank, and then in the film you show him standing in the water, and it's about shin high or knee high water, and there's no ice to be found.
The ice
which affects the polar bears. It affects
everything.
It affects everything. The birds and their migrations, and their whole habits of breeding.
Everything.
Yeah.
I mean, he was standing on ice when I originally photographed him. The ice is now 300 miles offshore.
It's pretty amazing. And wide-angle lens in this small cabin, right? This is a very tiny cabin.
Very tiny cabin. This, I believe, was the 1430, and beautiful lens, S lens. And it's window light. There's just a small window to camera right, and that's all that is illuminating George.
And sometimes simpler is better, but it still tells an amazing story. All right, impact here. What's going on with this bird? Where is this?
This is Cuba. This is in Trinidad, which is a UNESCO site. And this gentleman literally makes his living with the bird on his head. And I had spoken to, I think you know Peter Turnley. Mm-hmm. Peter and I had a long conversation before I went to Cuba. And one of the things he said is they're going to ask you for money for all of these pictures. And try not to give them money. But he said, if the kids come by, have a little pack on your side. Have a little army soldier kind of thing. Have a toothbrush, have a tube of toothpaste. I wound up giving this gentleman a toothbrush, and the look on his face was as if he had been blessed. He wanted that more than the peso, that anything. But he was so concerned over a dog fight that was back over my shoulder, and I was probably I tend to use a lot of longer lenses. It gives me workspace. It lets me let my subject have their own space. And I was probably using a 70 to 200, I'm sure. D4, I bet, maybe the D5. Love both of those cameras. And it's now with the mirrorless, I would be even sharper and even better.
I would assume you're shooting a series of pictures.
Yes, there are.
You can't get the perfection of the wings out, the look on his face, just the gesture of the hand on the chin.
Actually, I think I only have 4 frames of this. There are times when I get a little bit nervous, to be honest. When I'm on the street, I'm not a great street photographer. This particular trip was great for me for that, to get me to be better. In fact, you've chosen a couple of images from this trip. And I feel like I'm invading their space too much. So it's that judicious bit of seeing when they're willing to give, seeing when a person's willing to actually offer you an image. I don't like to think that I'm taking pictures. I'd rather like to think that you are offering me that picture. It's a gift. What we do is a gift. And so he gave me a nice gift, and the chicken, the rooster, was even more giving.
I love it. I just love the impact of this. Now, a little bit of backstory on this, 9/11, very trying time. I remember how tough it was on you, everybody, mentally, physically. As a photographer, we connected right away. There were a lot of journalists running into New York City doing their job. And your instinct is, I got to be involved, I want to jump in. But to jump in there and jump in the city, I'm just getting in the way of other people trying to tell this story, as tragic as it was. The document and the photos are so important for history, certainly. Talk a little bit about the project, talk about what you did, talk about this photo and how you got here.
Sure. As Mike said, 9/11 affected all of us, and in particular, if you were in New York at the time. And I was determined to have some sort of connection to the event. Psychologically, New York has always been my hometown. It's a source of my inspiration for photography, where I started my career. And I had been assigned to photograph the world's only giant Polaroid camera. And I had done that some months before. It was just a one-day assignment. And I fell in love with this instrument. It was actually the invention of Dr. Land. And it's a life-size camera. The camera itself is the size of a one-car garage. There's two people inside of it while I would be working it outside. And I hit on that camera as an interesting amalgam of old photographic techniques and modern technology. So 90 seconds after you make the picture, you have a life-size image that's 40 inches by 80 inches. And that became a show. I'll move forward fairly quickly here. It became a book, and this gentleman here, Louis Caccioli, was the cover of the book. And Louis had an astonishing series of events. He saved a lot of people on 9/11 day, and we've been friends ever since. And 10 years later, I made this photograph in connection with Nikon in a studio in Lower Manhattan. And Louis and I still check in with each other. And again, it's about the relationships you establish as a photographer and how you have to be honest and true. I mean, Jim said something very telling earlier. He said you have to be gentle with your subjects. You have to be true to your subjects. And in the flash of those lights, when you have someone in front of your lens and they're giving you the gift of their presence, you are making a silent agreement with them that you will be the good shepherd of their image. And that was particularly true in the aftermath of 9/11, because people came who were grieving, people came who had lost family. And I all of a sudden became the custodian, not only of these physical images, but also of their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions. And the project became a bridge for a lot of people to tell the story of their life as it intersected with 9/11. And so 10 years later, I made this picture of Louis. And, I mean, it's the same. I call him up, maybe once a year at this point. He goes, "How you doing, pal?" And he retired after 9/11, and he's the salt of the earth. He really is.
There's so many tangents to this, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, but when you invest yourself in a project and it almost breaks your studio, which it almost did, you gave everything to this. And not only did the benefits come back to you, just to try to be able to survive, but the books that were produced raised so much money for the 9/11 foundations or the firefighters, and that's where it all pays back. That's where the beauty of all of this comes, because I ended up running into him at the FDNY when he came into Brooklyn, because we were there servicing the photographers, trying to help them with gear. Their gear was getting destroyed, and tried to pull Nikon Pro Services into the mix to say, what can we do to help and stay out of the way?
Yeah.
And that's what our Pro Services are about. But you did back this up all on 4x5. I want to mention this. I think this is accurate. Every Polaroid sheet, make it or break it, is $300 or somewhere in that neighborhood. If you miss focus, if you miss that little nuance of sharpness, that's a throwaway. You put another $300 sheet on the wall or however it gets loaded in. Yeah. And that makes that even that much more trying. But what I loved about it is you interviewed everybody that came in, and everybody told their story. And all of a sudden, there was a line out the door of this studio, because all of the rescue workers and first responders heard about the project, and fire trucks would pull up to this place because everybody wanted to be in a photo, because they wanted to tell their story. And I find that to be crazy impactful. So thank you for sharing that. We talk about that on-the-fly portrait. Is this the Kentucky Derby or a horse race?
No, I wish it was. No.
It's okay. It's a horse race, though, right?
It's a horse race, but it's not a flat track race. I live in an area that has a very large equestrian theme, and we have a number of what we call point-to-point hurdle races. These are all jumping races. So this gentleman is a man named Eric Ports. Eric had a really tough day at the Willowdale Steeplechase, which I volunteer on their board. I volunteer on a lot of the different boards. It's a way for me to help my community, help maintain open space and a number of different charities like the Food Bank of Chester County. My client is the race. I have to do action pictures, portraits, everything about the race so that they can market it. In this case, Eric had a horrible race and was just covered in mud, and he's just outside. That's the white is the jockey's tent. Mm-hmm. And so I'm in the paddock and just trying to make quiet pictures, and it was just so lovely, just covered in mud. And I don't think he had a fall. I think that he had just simply been behind enough and gotten enough mud kicked into him. But there's just something about, for me, I've done these races and been the race photographer for, I think, 3 decades now. And the ability, because when you shoot a steeplechase race, you're on the track. You're not behind the rails, you're out in the thing. And having 10 horses, 2,000-pound horses, run within 8 feet of you, you feel them coming. If anyone ever saw my guilty pleasure movie, The Highlander, where they're talking about the quickening and how you feel, like feeling the stag, you feel those horses come into you. It's the most unique feeling. And then to see him after that was just,
Yeah, and I learned a long time ago, photographing horse racing, that the dirty jockey is the one that's behind.
Yeah.
Because they're getting kicked by the mud and the dirt of anyone else. So a clean jockey, clean horse usually wins wire to wire from beginning to end. And I love the detail in this, and that you've caught this on the fly.
And the weather was horrible. I'm shooting, in my case, I have to carry, well, in this case, I think this is a 200 to 500 on a D5. Then I've also got a 70 to 200 hanging on me, and I've got a 24 to 70 also, because I'm going from track to paddock to wind circle, and I have no time to stop. And I'm doing that the entire race. And so I've got to be able to go long. Oh, and then there are remotes out in the field on top of that. So basically I'm down, they're all in weather gear, I'm in weather gear, so just trying to move around and make it. But that 2 to 5 gives me the reach that I need to get.
Beautiful. All right, we've got one more image to share a story. Joe, it's yours. You and I spoke about this in communication with the subject, how you talk to them. This is a great story because you did not speak the same language. No. Where is this? What are the things that were really difficult about doing this? How'd you pull this off? Because it's not as easy as it seems.
No, it's nothing photographically is as easy as anybody here have clients who say, oh, it's just a picture? Yeah, hello, This is in the Joa Valley in Romania, which is historically was a major coal-producing area in Romania. And the industry there now is very slim compared to what it was back in its heyday. I've always loved the idea of physical labor and the way the cameras can celebrate that. And people work with their hands, people do interesting things. So I've worked in mines literally all over. And this particular mine was probably the most dangerous mine I think I've ever been in. And this particular image is a studio version of portraits I made under the ground with the Romanian mining crew that we went down together. And sometimes I was on my knees trying to clamber through small holes. We went down in an elevator about 1 kilometer, and then we moved 2 kilometers underneath a mountain. So at that point, there was probably 2.5 kilometers of earth above us, no electricity, just pressurized poles to keep the ceiling up. There were no light, only the miners' headlamps. I couldn't use a flash because coal dust is combustible, you know, so I'm using a small LED. And I spent the whole day with the crew down there, and I had to, even though I couldn't speak their language, I had to use them as my lighting grips, because I would position them and I would say, okay, here. And I was physically turning their heads to say, okay, your lamp here has to light here, okay? And then I used my LED for the main light at the camera. And this was actually, I turned this in as a solution for the Noct, the 0.95 58 millimeter Noct, because Nikon was like, this is the fastest lens ever, you know? Find some place that has no light. Well, I did, you know? And I went into this mine. And the thing that struck me about it was, as we're down there, I can't speak their language. They're laughing because they're saying things in Romanian about me and making fun of me, and that's fine, that's fine. As photographers, we step forward, we have to have a very high threshold of embarrassment, right? You know, to get that photograph. And then we all just started laughing, and through my interpreter, we started having conversation. And I thought to myself, this is the human spirit, where there's like maybe 8 or 10 of us. If anything bad happens down there, we ain't coming back, you know? But we're down there, and these men are working. I'm down there photographing, and we're having this mirthful conversation. And I thought, well, okay, all right, this is life, you know, and this is what photography gives you. Without a camera in my hands, I don't go in there. You know, I don't experience that. And that to me is Jay Maisel, a very dear friend for many years. He's always said, being a photographer is a license to steal experience. And that's very, very true. The camera becomes a visa, and you cross borders that are personal, emotional, as well as physical. Yep. And this was a major one for me down in that mine. I was scared to death, and at the end of the day, I was laughing with these miners.
You know who's more scared in any given moment? It's Lynn and Annie when you say, I've got a great idea.
My studio manager lives in active fear of my imagination. She's been with me for 33 years.
You want to do what?
Exactly. Yes.
That is very typical rejoinder. And Lynn is a blessing. She's a dear friend to Annie and I, and she has stuck with me through thick and thin. And there were times where I could not pay Lynn for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, because things got very dodgy after 9/11. But the thing about it is, when Jim and I were talking, you know, the magazines, a lot of the publications we worked for over the years, they're gone.
They're gone.
Who's still around?
The people we work for,
you know,
are basically gone.
Yep.
You know.
But the scruffy little freelancers,
yeah,
because we love this so much, we're not going to stop.
It's the way we communicate. It's how do I have a relationship with you? How do I have a relationship with you? Many, many times, it's through our photography. It's because I have a camera that I got to meet you, and then building that relationship. Sometimes, I admit this, if I'm doing an event, my camera is a buffer. I'll meet, we'll talk, and I might get a little nervous, and it's my way out because I see another picture that I have to go make. And I know so many people have that same experience. It's fine, but you've still had the initial meeting, you've still had those conversations, and you get to have more because you have that camera with you.
And then you keep those relationships going. So,
that's right.
Guys, I can't thank you enough. We're winding out of this segment. Your insight, your experience, your technique, but your vulnerabilities. I appreciate you guys opening up that way. Guys, thank you for being here. If you're tuning in, guys, we're going to take a little bit of a break. We're going to come back at 2:45. We've got the shooting bay open. Looks like we still have some t-shirts here if you're here. The fake tattoos, put them on, share them. We're going to come back this afternoon at 2:45, and we're going to delve into macro and detail work with an amazing macro photographer. If you've ever seen his work, Joey Terrell, a Nikon Ambassador, will be up here on stage at 2:45. But gentlemen, thank you. Audience, thank you guys. And we'll be back at 2:45.